And if any other country or any other prime minister or president said to you, look, we'd like to follow your example, what do we need to do apart from the rule book? The rule book we understand. What else do we need to do?
Well, you can either progress slowly or you can have a revolution.
But was it, I mean, you're a city-state. It's a very, relatively a very small
yes, so
country.
our problem is easier.
That does make it easier.
Our problem makes it much easier. If you're a big country, it's very hard. You can have a national level government which works, and then the local governments become very complicated.
Unfortunately,
we only have one level of government.
Right. I want to ask you now a particular question. You have been Prime Minister since 2004, but your party has been in power for half a century.
Yes. But we've won elections along the way.
Well, I've noticed. I ask these questions from a strong sense of envy. The longest the party I belonged to was able to be in power for was 18 years under Margaret Thatcher and John Major. That seemed a heck of a long time at the time. Yes. And by the time we lost power in 1997, my wife had said if we'd won it, she'd have asked for a recount. No, that was after 18 years. Is it healthy to be in power for 50 years?
I think there are some advantages if you can keep the system.
If you're Prime Minister, I can see that.
You don't want to be Prime Minister for 50 years or even 18 years. You want a system where there's continuity and there's change within that continuity. I think for a small country, discontinuous change is disruptive and could be dangerous. And luckily for us, we have been able to keep the system renewed. It's not the same people who were present at the beginning in 1959 who are in charge now, but we've had several changes of the guard and move with the times, with the population. And whether we can do that, whether we can maintain that position of trust and confidence and dominance in the system over the long term, that depends on Singaporeans, and also on how well we acquit ourselves and we establish ourselves in our own rights, not just as heirs to this success, but creators and builders on what the previous generation has done.
But at your last general election, if I'm not mistaken, your opposition did much better than ever before and got some 40% of the popular vote.
Yes, that's right.
That means that in terms of voting preferences, they're not a long way away from perhaps one day overtaking you and taking power.
Well, I don't think you can draw straight lines like that. In politics, things never progress in a linear fashion. And in the end, people will have to decide in Singapore what government they want and whom do they want to run the government. And the opposition in the last election didn't stand to run for government. In fact, the contrary. They made a point of saying, we're not going to run the government, please vote for me.
You think that's why they got 40% of the vote?
I think that's part of the factor. No, that is part of the factor.
Why should Singapore be different in this sense? I mean, being blunt about it, any opposition that says, don't worry, we don't want to run the government, either you don't believe them, or there's some very odd thing going on.
Well, the odd thing going on is that in Singapore, people actually know that the government generally is doing the right thing. But they'd like somebody to be there to put a bit more chili on the government's tail.
Okay, but I've mentioned that 40% voted for the government, but in terms of your electoral system,
no, 40% voted against
the government. I'm sorry.
In Britain, 40% votes for the government.
When we're lucky. We should be so lucky. We should be so lucky. But the fact is that there is nevertheless something that is less complimentary compared to the point you just put to me. 40% of the opposition voted for the opposition.
Yes.
But in a parliament of, 87 seats, the opposition won 7 or 8 seats.
The system is different. We have a first past of the post system, like
we do,
like you do. Mm-hmm. You mitigate that because in first past the post, home counties go Tory, Scotland goes Labour. We don't have Scotland.
You never know what might happen here.
So what we do have is really smaller than London, and it's uniform. We've made a point of making the different constituencies representative of a national mix, so you don't have Chinese constituencies and Malay ones. So it's a very flat political landscape, and if you tilt, you might suddenly have a complete change overnight.
Well, but
so once
every 50 years is not exactly overnight.
So therefore, Therefore, the way the parliament has to be built up and composed is different, and we've evolved. We are first past the post, but we've topped up beyond the people who win in the constituencies with non-constituency members, so that although the opposition won 6 seats, there are 9 opposition members, and we make sure that there's always a minimum representation of non-government members of parliament.
But a very serious point. We all know that if you have first past the post, it can sometimes mean that the government has a greater proportion of seats than its share of the vote justifies. That happens in many countries that have that system. In your case, because of the growth of support for the opposition, how tenable can that be in the longer term? Because if you have an opposition, let's say, that consistently gets 35, 40, 45% of the population, but even with top-ups is restricted to about 10% of the seats. Isn't that not going to create deep growing resentment and need some political reform?
There's a desire for more representation of voices in Parliament, and so, in fact, beyond the opposition-assured seats, we also have nominated members of Parliament who are neither government nor opposition, but they represent academia, unions, professions.
Not very democratic nominated members of Parliament.
You used to
we have the House
them
of Lords, but that's only one chamber. But that's not where the government comes from.
But the fact is, if you look at the way politics is played in Singapore, a lot of it doesn't happen in Parliament because the opposition in Parliament has decided it's politic for them not to propound policies or alternatives. They just snipe at the government from time to time, and when election comes, you have the opportunity to make a fuss and rouse issues and argue again to be re-elected.